Backlighting is one of the most powerful things you can do as a filmmaker, especially when you're shooting action sports or anything outdoors, to make your footage look and feel better. In this video, I'm going to talk about how to expose for it properly, how to use it properly, and how to avoid your footage becoming washed out. What is backlighting? Well, simply it's when the main light source, in this case the sun, is behind the subject. So I've got the camera, myself, and the sun behind me. So I'm currently backlit here. This is the opposite of front lighting, when you keep the light source behind the camera. And backlighting really adds a lot of depth to your video. It adds a bit of rim glow, dust and diffusion, and it really separates your subject from the background. Whereas when you shoot with a front light, it tends to flatten out your image a lot, and you can end up with the subject kind of blending into the background, and it just doesn't have that depth and drama that backlighting brings. The problem is with backlighting is that your camera naturally wants to try and protect highlights, and so when you shoot into the sun, it's often very hard to get the exposure correct. But backlighting doesn't mean you need to always shoot directly into the sun. It follows a 180-degree rule, so if you draw a line across the front of your camera lens, as long as the primary light source, or the sun, is in front of that 180-degree arc, your subject will be backlit. Here the sun is just over my left shoulder, and it still gives me that nice depth and the sort of drawn out shadows that I want from a backlit image. So how do you expose when you're backlighting? Well, the standard rule is always expose for the subject, not for the sky. However, that rule doesn't always work. And generally speaking, shooting action sports, I find the best way to lock in my exposure is actually to expose for the snow. So sort of pure white, bright snow here usually sits somewhere around 70% exposure. So as long as you expose the snow correctly, your subject may be a little bit darker, but that's going to give you the most realistic and accurate look in post. If your subject's exposed perfectly, but the snow is overexposed, it's going to ruin all of your footage and make it basically unusable. And if my sky or the sun itself gets a little bit blown out, I'm not too worried about that. It's okay to have some of your highlights lost. Practically the best way to do this is to use zebras, set them to 70%, and then make sure you've got zebras on your snow when you expose. It's really important you shoot in a log profile if your camera allows it. This is going to give you the maximum dynamic range so that you can get both those shadows and highlights exposed correctly. When you're shooting on snow, particularly skiing or snowboarding, all of the snow around you effectively acts like a really big bounce board, which means there's a lot of light not bumping around, especially on a bluebird or a sunny day. So you've got to be wary of that and make sure that you're not overexposing your footage. And kind of contrary to the standard rule where you'd sort of slightly overexpose log footage, I find that when you're shooting on snow, it's actually better to slightly underexpose, because almost always with the amount of light that you've got bouncing off the snow, you can kind of bring out some of the detail in those shadows. They're never as dark as pure shadows would be in, say, the forest or an urban setting. So I'm going to talk about 3 simple tips that you can use to help use backlighting in a way that isn't going to destroy your footage. Tip number 1, instead of placing the sun directly in frame, just let it kiss the edge of the frame. This is going to reduce haze whilst also keeping contrast. So you're still going to get that nice separation and that backlit feel, but you avoid getting that kind of washed out image that you often get when you shoot directly into the sun. Number 2 is to use your subject or a tree or a feature or something to block out the sun partially or entirely. So in this case, I've got the sun behind my head. If I move it, you're going to get these flares in the images. But by framing it directly behind me, I get that backlight without letting the sun fully wash out the image. This is also going to create really good separation by sort of putting those flares and glows around the side of whatever it is that's blocking the sun. And number 3, change the height. By lowering the camera and shooting up to your subject, you get a much stronger rim light, whilst also eliminating some of the problems where the sun can really take over and wash out that footage. A wider lens really exaggerates that backlight feeling, whereas a longer lens compresses the glow and makes it feel a lot more dramatic. And finally, think about the time of day you're shooting. Obviously, golden hour is always king. It's going to give you longer shadows, softer light, and a warmer glow, all of which is going to make your footage just look more dramatic and cinematic. Midday sun can be really hard to control. It's often really harsh, and especially on snow, you get a lot of deflection back up into the sky, which can make it very hard to light things well. Later on in the day, with the longer shadows, that sunlight deflects more at an angle and tends to act more like a fill light rather than it's a sort of really harsh underlight. When you haven't got a bluebird day or it's not super sunny and you haven't got that great light, it's the perfect opportunity to get in the trees. You know, I always tend to film anything I want to shoot that's in the trees on a flatter day. And that's because so many shadows in the trees already that we kind of don't want to emphasize those. And having that flatter light means you can get a bit better exposure between your shadows and your highlights when you're in an environment that has a lot of shadows. So there's going to be times where you can't backlight. If you can't backlight, as much as possible, try to side light. And if you have to shoot with a direct front light, I would always try to isolate the subject from the background another way. Whether that's by getting down really low and shooting them against the sky so that you have a little bit of separation, or finding an area where you've got a natural bounce, like a berm, a roller, or something that's going to bounce light back against the back of the subject so that you get a little bit of backlighting through that kind of bounce. You can also think about using things like trees or cliffs. I've got a big cliff band right here on my left that's acting like a kind of natural absorption board and taking away some of that faux light to give that bit of contrast. So it can be really useful to think about your environment and not only what you can use as a bounce, namely the snow, but also what you can use to counteract that. Cliff faces, trees, anything that's dark really. So I just want to show you the difference between the kind of backlighting and front lighting. So here I'm backlit with the sun behind me. If I turn around and face this way, you can see how flat, with that front lighting, how flat the image looks, and I lose all of that detail and goodness. So to summarize, backlighting is super powerful if you use it intentionally. You know, it can give you that depth and separation, and really nice intentional flare. But it's not about just shooting into the sun. There are lots of considerations that factor into how and when you use it. I hope that's been useful, and I also just want to take this opportunity to say that at the start of this winter I had about 500 subscribers on YouTube, and now we're pushing 900, which is absolutely mind-blowing to me. You know, that number's small to a lot of YouTube channels, but for me it represents the first kind of big milestone. But mostly I just want to say a huge thank you, and every single one of you, it means the world to me. And yeah, I'll see you in the next one. All the best.